Hello from Tokyo. My name is Chris Grimes, and I'm the executive editor at Nikkei Asia. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our webinar this evening, Myanmar, How Should the World Respond? This is our second webinar on Myanmar since the coup on February 1st. Since then, we've seen conditions deteriorate dramatically, with the military killing protesters in the street and the economy grinding to a standstill. I'm honored to have this distinguished panel of Myanmar experts with me to talk about what's happening in the country, as well as responses from the international community and from businesses, including businesses on the ground in Myanmar. So allow me to introduce our panelists now. First, we have Romain Kayode, who's a principal at SIPA Partners, an advisory firm in Tokyo. They do risk and reputation management and crisis management. He lived in Myanmar from 2008 to 2015, and he may be familiar to Nikkei Asia readers. Just a day after the coup, on February 2nd, we published a piece that he wrote called Why Myanmar's Generals Turned Back to a Dark Past. Next, we have Alexander Dimitrenko, who's the head of Asia Sanctions at Freshfields Bruckhaus Derringer, based in Tokyo. He leads the global investigations practice in the Tokyo office, where they focus on sanctions, export controls, human rights, and other issues. But he's a specialist on sanctions, so we're very lucky to have him here. Next, we have Thierry Thanmon, who's a native of Myanmar, and she returned to the country 8 years ago. She's a managing partner at Pegu Partners, which is an investment firm there. And she also serves as CEO of the Myanmar Institute of Directors. And finally, we have Gwen Robinson, who will be familiar to anyone who saw our previous webinar on Myanmar back in February. She's editor-at-large at Nikkei Asia, based in Bangkok, and is a longtime Myanmar watcher who's interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi a number of times and has done some outstanding reporting in recent weeks, along with our excellent team on the ground in Myanmar and across Southeast Asia. So we're going to start with Alexander, who's going to walk us through the issues around sanctions and what they mean for Myanmar. And so to start us off, Alexander, can you catch us up on what's changed regarding sanctions since the coup on the 1st of February?
Thank you, Chris, and hello everyone from Tokyo. Indeed, great to be here. I wish we weren't talking about Myanmar sanctions, but hey, here we are. So, I've prepared a few slides which may help us go through some of the sanctions elements. As you can imagine, they are difficult, and especially for businesses to comply. There are some elements that probably go beyond this webinar, and happy to discuss separately. But to answer your question, what we've seen so far is a targeted approach to sanctions and export controls by the US government, but also allowing itself a potentially a repeat of earlier sanctions, which were pre-2012, which were focusing and targeting the entire government of Myanmar. The reason for the current targeted approach is really, I believe, in the business interests. A lot of companies are in Myanmar doing business and have been doing business who were not expecting coup to happen. So if you target senior members of the government or government itself, you may actually have difficulty for businesses to continue working there. The other concern in this matrix that I proposed is the geopolitical considerations. And I put e.g. China. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but basically US has to be careful as to which direction it will push Myanmar onwards.
Right.
If you look at the actual sanctions, and I mean, in interest of time, I don't want to go through all of these points here, but Chris, to answer your question, what are the sanctions? Well, there are 14 individuals and 9 companies that have been named. I would call it as a important warning shot that's heard loud and clear internationally. The individuals do belong to the current junta, but they're targeted in their personal capacity, which means that the government they represent is not affected by the sanctions. The companies, you'd see them as kind of third-tier again, military-owned companies, which means that anything below them will fall in the category of blocked entities with sanctions applicable to them, but nothing above. But again, OFAC and the government of the US have the ability to go as high up as they want. Critically, the sanctions we're discussing do apply to US persons and US nexus primarily, but as we've seen with other sanctions regimes, there's reference to material support that may be provided by non-US persons to the sanctioned entities that will put them in also target category. And then when you think about what is the impact on businesses, well, there are three things I wanted to mention. One is the Myanmar moving from a green light category where business was welcomed to a yellow flag category, unfortunately, for Myanmar. And that puts particularly financial institutions at the crossroads. They have to be careful as to what businesses are allowed and what transactions, payments can go in and out. It also puts long-term projects in Myanmar at a bit of a question mark. And I'll work on the next slide as to how we can deal with this. Critically, I think the last point here is any dealings with military and especially military business arms, MEHL and MEC in particular, they do become risky. So on the next slide, what I wanted to kind of, again, lay the foundation, as you mentioned, is to say there are certain risk mitigating factors. Nothing will surprise you here, and it's maybe because I do sanctions all the time. It's a similar advice, but you do start with kind of the initial point: reduce your U.S. nexus, reduce your U.S. payments, move the currency, do careful due diligence, make sure you're not working with military or its business arms. And if you do, try to reduce or suspend those transactions to the extent possible. Again, if your transactions now, nothing prohibits you from maybe working with Myanmar and Myanmar government, etc. But get the prepayments or an ability to get paid quickly, because if sanctions do escalate, you may only have a short window to receive any outstanding payments that may be due to you, because otherwise, once it closes, the banks won't transfer the money. And frankly, the key point here is to look into the agreements which companies have with Myanmar and to ensure that those agreements have, in fact, ability to exit or suspend the obligations in case of sanctions escalation. That may be difficult to renegotiate, and that may be difficult for people to have sanctions wording in the agreements themselves, but it is possible to rely on force majeure and other measures if they're properly drafted. So I'll stop here, Chris, because this is the highlights and the foundation. I'm sure we'll have more to discuss.
Yes, we can talk about all sorts of things about the efficacy of sanctions and whether this is the right approach and so forth further on. But that's really interesting, and thanks for laying the foundation for us. So let's move on now to Theory, who's actually in Myanmar now, I think she has had some internet problems, but can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Sorry.
Okay, fantastic.
Hopefully it'll stay stable.
It seems like a good connection now. So just to pick up on what Alexander was saying, is this this idea of sanctions looming? Is this on people's minds at companies on the ground in Myanmar? How much is this weighing on people at the moment?
At the moment, it's a crisis situation. So most of the companies on the ground, both domestic and foreign, are thinking more about operational issues. And I think sanctions are in the back of the mind, but not really, front and center, because right now operations is just so difficult, with the banking sector closing, logistics not really that possible. In the streets of Yangon, there's just roadblocks everywhere. So a lot of businesses are just having to proceed day by day as to whether they can even operate that day. So right now it's more that which is front and center. People are worried about employee safety. People are genuinely worried whether they can keep employees employed. So a lot of the businesses that I know are looking at possibilities to still pay the workforce, but maybe at least being able to control costs so that they can withstand the storm. And on sanctions, at least the governments that I've spoken to are aware of, just know that blanket sanctions do not work. This country was subjected to some of the most severe sanction regimes in the world, and it didn't work, right? It actually just crippled the private sector. It shows that the last 10 years of opening has actually created a more resilient population that can withstand what's happening now with the military trying to come back and take over. So I think most people are aware that sanctions are blunt instruments trying not to affect, but obviously in a situation like this, with brands being worried about maybe not sanctions by the governments, but maybe as it happened back in the 90s, it's starting to happen now. Certain brands are worried about just consumer boycotts overseas as well, and saying that they don't care enough about Myanmar, do something, but then that will have an equivalent impact of sanctions. So yes, worried, but there are a lot more pressing things to worry about at the moment.
Right. That's right. Okay. And we'll return to some of these themes again in a second. Romain, before the coup, investment in Myanmar was rising. The World Bank reported a 33% jump in foreign direct investment in Myanmar last year. So this was progress, right? But what we're starting to hear about now is whether companies remain in the country. They came in, they took a risk, and how much longer do they remain committed?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And I think this is why the coup is such a shock. Of course, most and foremost for the Myanmar population, which is currently being hit not only by bullets, but also by an economic disaster, which is growing every day, and really by violence, which I expect will increase further as we get closer to March 27, which is Armed Forces Day. And this is understood to be the day by which the military junta, the State Administrative Council, SAC, would want to see things back in order. The issue with the way SAC operates, they are blunt, much more blunt than sanctions, and they have defined a roadmap which they announced the day after the coup, with the potential elections being held in 1 year, etc., etc. And they just want to stick to that plan. However, this is a plan that is clearly not workable unless it will bulldoze through its own people at the cost of many lives and at the cost also of the economic environment. And so really, I think the question for businesses, foreign ones who can leave, but also local ones that will seek to continue to operate as much as they can, is what can be done on one hand to try to protect staff, to protect assets, to just keep running, as Thierry was saying, and on the other hand, to contribute positively to trying to create an off-ramp for this growing crisis. Because again, the disaster, the economic disaster is growing every day, and political risks are increasing as well. And I will conclude by saying that the more the international community waits, even though I understand that there are no easy solutions to this crisis, but the more there is a wait and see approach that is adopted, the more difficult it will be to solve this crisis. Both sides, the opposition, you can talk about who they are really, and SAC are becoming increasingly radicalized. And there is again no off-ramp, no exit strategy that has been defined that is workable for both sides. And so that's a big question mark. And I think this is what, beyond sanctions, companies need to be watching, because the longer this lasts, the more this escalates, the less possible from a legal, compliance, reputation, and operational perspective it will be for businesses to continue to operate in Myanmar.
Right. So let's turn to Gwen now. Just yesterday, Gwen, you and some of our colleagues published just a brilliant piece of reporting about what's going on in Myanmar's banks and this really difficult position that they found themselves in. Can you tell us a little bit about what your reporting found yesterday and the situation there? Yeah, so you're muted, Gwen. Gwen, you're muted.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, it happens all the time. So just to provide a little bit of background to that story, which found that the banking sector not only is in a big crisis, but is actually facing new and very, very disturbing pressure from the junta, not only to reopen under threat of having individual deposit accounts seized and transferred to military and state-owned banks if they do not reopen, but also there is a separate growing narrative that we're seeing coming out of the junta, which is really building a case, I think, against so-called foreign interference, which they're charging or accusing the administration of State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi of, which is to really be getting foreign support. And this applies to everything from NGOs to INGOs. So now the banks have been ordered to hand over account details for all NGOs and international NGOs operating in Myanmar, which puts this is going back to 2016. In addition, there's been targeting of certain key NGOs, which have been ordered, the banks have been ordered to hand over, audit these organizations. So clearly a growing strategy as the military builds its case. And we all know, I think, that Aung San Suu Kyi remains in detention and has been charged with on a number of accounts, but including lately accusations of bribery, which will lead back clearly to interaction and support by international organizations. And today I saw a chart circulating which is linked to the military allegations that even accuse the World Bank and the IMF of being part of this conspiracy. So we can expect a lot more pressure on the banks. And frankly, with this growing civil disobedience movement and really a boycott by a lot of staff of their jobs, not just in banking, we've heard, hospitals, transport, even tax collection. These banks are really in a hard place. One bank that issued a plea last week for workers to come back to work was severely criticized on social media as not supportive of civil disobedience because they were asking workers to come back. They weren't threatening, but even the asking them, I think, was seen as not being, particularly solid for the movement. So there is a lot of problems for the banks. And meanwhile, we've got a paralysis with, as I think Thierry pointed out, cash flows, money transfers. This goes into payrolls, and it's all sort of coming together to create a lot of stresses in the broader system. And I'll come later maybe to some of the recent research and warnings by the UN agencies such as World Food Programme about growing hardships related to prices and food and the resulting increasing poverty.
Thank you. So you're talking about a reversal of liberalization in the banking sector that we've seen over the last 10 years. And
exactly, really just erasing all the gains and going back. Well, we're talking about an essential, possible, partial kind of nationalization of if deposits are seized and forcibly transferred. I think that sort of amounts to a nationalization of sorts, and very worrying for both investors and individuals.
Right. So Thierry, before we went live, you were telling us just about where you are and what's been going on with the companies around there. There's you're around. Not far from you, I think, are some factories, right, that have been really disrupted. I think viewers would be really interested just to hear what you've been seeing and what you think is happening with these companies.
Correct. So I live very close to an industrial zone where actually a lot of garment factories operate, other types of factories as well. And that also means that a lot of the population here are economic migrants from other parts of the country. And, you know, the garment sector, for example, it's not as big as a lot of other countries, but it's been incredible at employing women, giving people, you know, having that financial independence and contributing to their own economies as well. There's remittances that go back to the rural communities because of people working here. And it's been stressed since COVID because of supply chain issues. And now with the ports being closed, some of the factories have not been able to pay staff because most of the staff will not have bank accounts. So it's not like you can transfer money for them to go and withdraw from ATMs, which are still operating in some level. So I think that's the tensions within employer-employee relations in some of the banks. Worryingly, there's a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment as well. And that's worrying because there's a lot of native Myanmar Chinese business people as well, and just population. So any kind of racial tension, of course, is worrying. And recently, since Sunday, a few factories have burned down. So I know factory owners who are just worried. So they're worried for their employee safety. They've had to close the factories. They don't even know if they can go and check in on their factories. So it's a tough environment, and you get international groups also highlighting that a few brands have been asked why they're still working with Myanmar, still operating, but there are always two sides, right? On the one hand, if you don't operate here, it's really the bottom of the pyramid population, people who work, on daily wages that suffer. They won't have work anymore, and it's. The garment sector has been highlighted as one of the sectors which has effectively prevented human trafficking of some of the vulnerable populations. And so all of that's coming back. And it's just a very, right now, if I go outside of my gates, it's like a war zone, barricades, tires burning, and the tensions are high. People are stressed. They're not, they're worried for their lives, but still going out. And as Romain mentioned, it's getting more and more severe from each side. There's not a lot of room for middle ground, and moderate voices are being silenced across the society. So I am worried about just increasing loss of life and violence.
Thank you. So Alexander, Thierry's just telling us about the impact all of this is having on really vulnerable parts of the population. And this goes to one of the criticisms of the sanctions regime, certainly that existed before, that they really, maybe they had some impact on the military, but really the worst impact was on the people that Thierry's talking about, the more vulnerable people in the population. So if you could just kind of give us the idea here that we're wrestling with, that the international community wrestles with on the issue of sanctions, and where to go from here. And you're muted,
Yeah, follow Goran's example. Well, it's a difficult dilemma for the international community because the options are limited as to how you can respond to the situation on the ground. So obviously sanctions, economic sanctions, the trade controls have been utilized, because they're, while they may affect the population, they do primarily target those who are responsible, and they're for let's say junta in this case. The other option may be, with military intervention. What other options would the US have, for instance, to really restore the order and help the society to be back into the democratic process? So, and look, I don't want to take responsibility for how effective sanctions are or not. I think they are obviously effective. We've seen this with Iran. When Iran came back to the negotiation table, we've seen this most successful example is USSR. I was born in Soviet Russia, and we know that we suffered, But ultimately, it led to collapse of the system, and it led to the opening of society, etc. Again, not commenting on where Russia is now. But the sanctions do work, and unfortunately, the impact maybe, as you're saying, and as Thin is saying, the society in general will suffer. But the only other option would be for the world not to do anything. So I think and maybe one more point to mention: U.S. has actually been learning about sanctions and improving and improvising sometimes. And in this case in particular, one example is that they're using more of the export controls. They're in a way more severe than the sanctions because they moved Myanmar to a different category of exports, and it may impact the industries again that they're in that category. But they hopefully will not have as dire impact on society domestically. But I agree with Sini. Currently, the current sanctions have little to do with the situation on the ground, unfortunately, one way or the other. But as situation escalates, we may well see that the response from the national governments in the US and other countries, if people do die and if lives are lost and the situation becomes out of control, then the sanctions may be the only answer.
Right. Thank you. Romain, we were talking again before we went live here about the kind of difficult geopolitics of this, where the U.S. has to worry about China and whether whether more sanctions would push Myanmar closer to China. Can you tell us about that? And actually, there's a little bit of history, right, about Myanmar and China, and at some point they weren't so happy with the relationship. I think you would know more.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to that, but I think first I want to mention that actually the key actors in this crisis are the domestic actors. And the China and the US and the EU and Japan are really on the sidelines and observing, and then trying to decide how to respond, how to intervene based on how the events are unfolding on the ground. Because really what is happening was not the plan that the military junta had when they took over on February 1. The plan was that there would be maybe some pushback, but general acceptance. Some people who had served under the Tencent government from 2011-2015, when we saw this reform process start. And so there was this idea that Tencent 2.0 type administration could be put in place, where foreign countries, including the US, foreign investors would agree to work with this military regime, even though its legitimacy was disputed, but it will be acceptable. And this wrench has been thrown into that plan by the civil disobedience movement, now by the setup of a quasi-government in exile called the CRPH, and that are driving an agenda which has a lot of dangers, of course, and which is creating a lot of collateral damage given its impact on the economy. But at the same time, it's an all-in strategy. And I think this is why it's important to acknowledge that this crisis is not going to die down. It's not going to be like Thailand and Hong Kong, people will go home and things will move on. We are in a situation where on both sides, there is readiness to go all the way. And this is described as a final struggle, martyrs, etc. So it's extremely, really violent. And so looking outside, I think China, the US, other players are wondering, do we want to provide more support to this opposition movement, even though it might create more damage on the economy? And really also the question being, is the junta ready to go full on North Korea style? Are they ready to nationalize the economy, to lash out completely on the population? Like, by the way, they are already doing. It's really like troops going around urban centers, shooting randomly at people. So I think, really there are these looming questions in the background, which I think also are being asked in China. And then the impact that such a radical escalation, which is unfolding, has been unfolding and is escalating, what would that mean for their interest in the country? And as a result, what type of response can be done, whether bilaterally or in a coordinated manner?
Thank you. That's fascinating. I see, Gwen, you were nodding your head. Romain brought up this idea of the sort of government in exile, which you and I have talked about on the telephone before. Could you, how do you know how seriously this is? I mean, how is the international community viewing that group of former NLD people?
It's a very good question, Chris, and I think it applies to every level of the international community, from the UN and actual sovereign governments down to even NGOs, INGOs, companies. How seriously to take the often called parallel government or shadow parliament, whatever you call this body known as the CRPH. One thing that can be said for sure, there is no other alternative to the CRPH at this point. No body meaning entity, has come forward that would parallel or match that. And it's not, again, CRPH is not a big organization. It started with just 17 people who were elected in the elections last November 8th, which is the election that the military claims touched off the entire coup because they're saying it was fraudulent. These 17 are very brave MPs who got together and had a virtual swearing-in ceremony, set up this group, appointed an international representative who I think many people watching this may have seen on TV, called Dr. Sasa, and also then started assembling a kind of pseudo cabinet. I mean, everyone knows they do not control territory, they don't control any, sovereign wealth, but they have fairly credible representatives that are taking responsibility for key portfolios to kind of match the junta and the junta structure of government by having ministers, they're calling them, dealing with things like energy, health, etc. So that is the CRPH. How seriously to take it? It's very, very messy, because at the moment, I think a lot of people did see the spectacular defection or denunciation by Myanmar's ambassador to the UN last month, who stood up in the General Assembly, denounced the junta, held up 3 fingers and said everyone should support the CRPH. The junta immediately dismissed him, wrote a dismissal letter. The UN has not recognized that letter. The ambassador is still sitting in the UN. That creates a very odd situation, because technically, I mean, the world has to really decide. They are not recognizing the junta as the government of Myanmar, and they are recognizing this ambassador as the representative of the CRPH. No one has actually managed to definitively say this, but that was followed by a similar but milder denunciation by the ambassador in London. And then similarly, we've seen slightly lower level diplomats also either defect or say they can't support the government. So we've seen that in Berlin and other places. So that kind of raises the question, who are these people representing? I think that really creates a dilemma for a lot of governments. They don't feel CRPH is perhaps, a recognizable government that they can work with. They absolutely do not want to work with the junta. And I think the key question will come down to economics, and maybe that's where Alexander comes in again. But for example, one of the biggest money earners in Myanmar, I think you might have mentioned this, is the oil and gas. And the government oil and gas body, the MOGE, takes huge revenues from oil, mostly foreign oil and gas companies. They pay fees to MOGE, as it's called, and the CRPH has called them to put these funds into escrow and not pay the junta. Similarly, the civil disobedience movement is asking companies not even to pay taxes. So these are big dilemmas. And I think that says something about the status of CRPH, but frankly, it is the only body. And so I think a lot of international people trying to broker some kind of compromise, including the UN envoy to Myanmar, are in regular touch with the CRPH as broadly at least a representative of the National League for Democracy government and Aung San Suu Kyi to negotiate, to try, I think, to forge some kind of agreement to mediate. But I can't see the CRPH agreeing to negotiate with the military or vice versa, in fact.
Right. So, Alexander, Gwen helpfully provided the
Segue
seg
into the next.
Yeah, but this is a fascinating question. The oil and gas group has been getting more attention lately. Tell us what the situation is now, and are there any sanctions on that group at the moment, and what is the connection with the military?
So no current sanctions on any company in oil and gas industry. I think the concern obviously being that they are, as Gwen explained, that there is a relationship with the current junta and military arms, and that money coming from abroad or going to abroad, that will be subject to either escrow mechanisms, which are typical in this situation, or freezing if there's a US element, US dollars going through US will have to be frozen, for instance. Again, currently no sanctions have been imposed. But one concern is with the escalating situation on the ground is that what will happen next? And as we discussed earlier, the natural escalation domestically may lead to escalation in sanctions, and that will may impact the breadwinners for military, and which will inevitably be defense sector is already targeted, but energy. And frankly, if you look worldwide, energy sector is accustomed to sanctions. Venezuela, Russia, Iran, those are all major players in the energy field. So a lot of companies have, I would say, they're used to being in this zone where sanctions do apply fairly significantly. But again, currently you don't see anything. So companies, I know Japanese companies do still work with some of the projects. But the issue will be, Chris, is what do you do with long-term projects? If you have an EPS, if you have oil projects, if you have a long-term contracts, can you exit if you need to? Can you suspend your relationship? What can you do if sanctions do escalate? How can you change that relationship? And that will depend on each situation in particular.
Right. So, Thierry, I think you have some other points to make about sanctions as well.
I mean, I feel quite strongly about sanctions because I grew up in this country under sanctions, and I just see what that does to the normal population. The elite will go on, right? The military will go on. If we go North Korea style, the elite within any kind of ruling environment will be fine. I mean, if you look at the Myanmar military, they are already a parallel organization. They're incredibly insular and isolated. They don't think the way other people think. This country stayed under sanctions for many, many years, and the country didn't open up 10 years ago because of sanctions. It might work for others, but we don't. We Myanmar are characteristically stubborn, and it doesn't bring people into the negotiation table. It actually drives people away. And I actually have a very, very strong view that just blanket sanctions and putting countries in naughty corners and not engaging is actually intellectually and morally lazy. It's a pat on the back that you can do if you're a big government and say, we're doing something, we care, so we won't talk to you. I mean, that doesn't make sense in many, many circumstances, especially now where we talked about the resistance movement. That's the people. And you can't talk about the economy being separate from the people, because it's the people that need to earn a living. The people need to be able to provide for their families and at least be able to feed themselves if they are going to do anything. So just turning off all the taps and squeezing the country out of its ability to have a living is not helping. It's not helping anything. And it's not going to hurt the people that the outside world wants to hurt. So it needs to be targeted. Blanket sanctions do not work.
I'd like to follow up with you on that, because you have made an interesting point in the past just about what the people have gained in the last decade or so, and how that is fueling the resistance that you're seeing. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. If you look at, a lot of people compare this to 1988, where there's uprising. And one of the things that strikes me is how emaciated people looked back then. If you look at people who were striking, they were just poor. They just didn't have anything to stand up to. And it was a poor, malnourished country. And, when you're in that stage, a lot of people went on the streets back then, mainly because of hunger. And mainly because they just couldn't sustain themselves. Now people are going out on the streets because they feel that their futures have been taken away. This is a morally wrong thing that has been done to them, and they're able to actually stand up. And you see, a different kind of populace out on the streets. They're stronger, they're bigger, they're more agile, they're creative. That happened because of the economic gains that we had in the last 10 years.
Amazing. And they're connected too, digitally, right?
Absolutely. And that's something that, it's really underappreciated. Sorry, my children are screaming in the background. That's really maybe not underappreciated. I think people talk about it, but, the country that I grew up in, it was North Korea. We didn't have outside media. We didn't have books. The education system was completely decimated. So you completely empty out people's minds, and much less being connected to the world. We didn't even know what was happening in the next town, because those connections were not there either. That connection, and that's just I've been so impressed with the young people, how much knowledge they were able to get just from having, connection to the outside world, being able to watch YouTube videos, and teach themselves. And that's still with the education system being actually quite poor. We have an average schooling of 5 years. It's a sad statistics. It's coming up. Poverty levels were incredibly high. They were coming down. If you look at the Human Development Index, we're one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of, maternal mortality, and all the different measures that you have on human development. All of those were coming up. And part of it is this connectivity, because it's not just, government directing, right? It's people helping each other, just businesses, small businesses being able to have that creativity to drive their business, employing people. And you can't underestimate that. And I really hope that, now, of course, it breaks my heart every time some part of the internet gets switched off. And now we don't have mobile internet. We don't have, the wider web that you can access went down. So I still have internet now, but who knows? And that the damage that it does to information flows in people's minds is massive. It's a completely different population now because we didn't have sanctions. I am a huge believer in that.
Interesting. Thank you. Romain, you had a point that you wanted to make about the political economy, about investors, and about local business.
Yeah, I think, first, really good point by Thierry, and the gains of the last 10 years have been so amazing. I first lived in Yangon in 2006. The capital city had just moved to Naypyidaw the year before, and Yangon was dark, no light, trash everywhere. It was really, really gloomy, to say the least. And then I moved back to the country in 2008, and then I saw the reforms, and I helped foreign investors come into the country. And I think really the direction then, of course, there were limited expectations towards the military, but there was this acknowledgement that they were part of the solution, and they were opening up, accepting to open up to let the country move towards a better future, which will give them continued control over part of the state, especially the security forces and the rest, but that there could be an economy, a political scene that could blossom, and independent media and all the rest. And I think on February 1, people realized that this could be coming to an end, hence the reaction. And I think what I wanted to say is that what has happened since February 1 shows that no one, how well connected, how powerful, is above the reach of the Tamado in Myanmar. We know that at the moment there are very, let's say, wealthy, connected people who are in Naypyidaw or who are under house arrest, that are interrogated, that are being watched. And also another example, there was this exodus recently from Yangon. You saw in other cities cars being packed with luggages and stuff, and they moved to Naypyidaw. And what I understand is that families of military officers and others close to the junta were called back to Naypyidaw, not for their security only, but also so that they can be kept hostages. This is the thinking of the way this junta is thinking at the moment. And so my point, moving into what this means for investors and local businesses, as this crisis unfolds, you're going to see a political economy that is going to be completely, not completely, but significantly transformed. Let's see where things fall in the end, but very likely you will see some businesses that were seen as not supportive enough of the junta lose business licenses, be put aside, and then new cronies being brought in, similar to what happened on the before 2010, right? Really access to decision makers in this junta is what's going to be required in order to do business in the country. With all the corruption and the lack of rule of law and the rest that comes with that. And so to conclude, the ability for foreign investors to conduct business in a place like Myanmar will be under a lot of question. And I really, like Thierry, I really want aid to continue to come in. I really want foreign investors to come in. I want garment workers to keep their job. I want the economy to keep growing. But because of the actions of SAC, of the junta, and it has been getting worse and worse, and it will continue to get worse until March 27 and likely after, the business environment just become unviable. And so I think it is beyond sanctions. Really, sanctions are a question and they will hit from a legal perspective, but I think beyond that, the risks are really enormous.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you have something to add, Gwen? Or?
Well, yeah, I think Romain drew it really well, and also Thierry on the question of sanctions, but there is still, and I think correctly, the distinctions being made. I agree with Thierry about blanket sanctions, and as Alexander pointed out, there's a lot that can be done. But I think if it gets to things like, for example, one of the few agencies that is allowed to move around inside Myanmar, this is even under the NLD government, which restricted movements of a lot of aid agencies, particularly, for example, in Western Rakhine State. But the World Food Programme had license to move around and feed, distribute not just food, but cash, actually, because it was getting harder and harder to deliver food. This is even earlier on. So they have a big network of cash distributions to buy food. And all that is not only likely to be, impossible to transact under in this current situation, but also this is amongst the kind of operations that will be hit by the banking crisis because they're keeping money in. You can't have a UN agency with accounts that are nationalized by the Burmese military. That's a problem. So I think that the whole sanctions and the question of punitive measures brings in very complicated issues like that. And even when you're talking about humanitarian, it won't be easy to separate, say, a program like that from its complication with the banking system and other things. But on another point, I'd just like to say, we talked about the military or the Tatmadaws strategy and its focus on Armed Forces Day and having it all cleared up because they're so obsessed with their image, but probably continuing on after that to finish the job. But I think it should be said that the civilian, the unarmed protest movement has been accused of lacking strategy and just being an angry, unarmed civilian movement out there on the streets, incredibly brave, but no real strategy. In fact, I think they have a huge and devastating strategy for the military, which is to deny Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general who's in charge of the junta, and the generals on the junta, what they most want, which is control of the country and economy. And so far, this civil disobedience movement has given them far stiffer resistance than they could have imagined. And no amount of brutality, violence, torture, maiming, arrest is stopping that. You know, workers are not going back to work. And if you ask me, I think that is practically the most effective, powerful weapon that you know, the protesters could employ. So I think the really key question is, how long can these brave people hold out? And second, I think that if they get armed, and already there's a push to make weapons, there's a lot more use of incendiary, you know, Molotov cocktails, things like that. This is all going to, of course, invite more repression and escalate into a possible, you know, full-on. People talk about the Syria, Libya kind of scenarios, but that's a real question. But for now, as Thierry said, the population is extremely accustomed to hardship and denial. And so, you know, you've got a lot of hardcore out there. I think they could last for quite a while.
So I think it's time for Q&A. I mean, this has been fantastic. So, and we've got a lot of, I've just been looking through the questions. We have a lot of questions and a lot of very good ones. So if it's okay with the panel, I'm going to ask them, and we can, you know, we can, everybody can take a turn. So the first question here is, do you think that the previous international expectations for Myanmar to fully democratize were unrealistic and even counterproductive? After all, the country's been in a civil war for decades. Alexander, do you want to have a crack at that?
I'm probably not an expert.
Yeah. Okay.
I can take a crack at it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be great.
I think most definitely not counterproductive. I think it's yes, the country was in civil war, but it's a country in civil war in very you know, it's only in the periphery. That's usually in the civil war type conditions. The middle part of the country has been more or less peaceful. So I think that's fine. Definitely the expectations were way out of line. You know, a lot of people, I think, expected Myanmar to turn into a Vietnam overnight, and that the democratic transition is going to be 100% complete. I mean, we don't even have that in the other countries in the region. Why do you expect Myanmar, with the history that we have, to do that? So I think there's a lot of people who are dreaming when the initial transition did happen, but because of that dream, maybe a lot of investment came in, not as much as you would think, because it was a difficult transition for the private sector to operate efficiently, but you know, but that helped. So definitely not counterproductive. Yes, a lot of people were in la la land in the beginning.
Right.
If I can jump in here, I think we should not forget that Myanmar was a budding parliamentary democracy in the 50s after independence that was put to an end by the military because of complicated reasons. And then it's a military that said they created this roadmap towards what they call disciplined democracy. And so actually the military themselves claim that their end goal is to let democracy flourish in Myanmar, as they say. Now they want to do that under their own terms. The thing is that the NLD and other opposition parties had accepted those terms after 2010. They were brought into this fold designed by the military, and until the military, or maybe more specifically Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general, decided that these terms did actually not fit his agenda. And then, so it's actually, again, I think I mean, I don't want to talk about the expectation of the outside community, but it's really more in terms of the domestic situation. You have people who have been in jail, people who have suffered a great lot, who accept in a spirit of national reconciliation, you know, and Myanmar people can be very generous to put these feelings aside and to play the game designed by the military in order to work together, because there was work together with the military in parliament, in government, through other institutions, to try to bring the country forward. And then the military says, well, actually, that doesn't work for us. We think there have been election frauds, which, by the way, I mean, we can jump into that. I suppose there is a question, but, you know, and then comes up with all these stories, made of stories, and decide that the plan has changed now. And we will have a disciplined democracy, but without the NLD. But the people have voted twice for the NLD, and they re-elected them. So again, I think, you know, it's what type of democracy exactly Myanmar should have, federal democracy, etc. There are so many questions, it's quite complicated. But in terms of the rule of law, the constitution, there was a framework that had been set up by the military. Parties had all accepted, the US, everyone accepted to reconcile and work together under this framework. And then on February 1, the military decided, no, it doesn't work for us anymore, we're gonna change route. So I think, you know, the expectations were maybe somewhat too big, but I really think it's really what happened inside the military with the military that bear questions. Why do that now? And to what extent does that benefit them as an institution? And I think this question is currently being asked, of course, quietly, because a lot of risks there for people who would go against the wish of the senior leadership. But I think there are serious questions being asked in the military, around the military, as to what is happening now is actually in the interest of the institution, short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And I think that's one of the scenarios we will have to see and watch. It's difficult to know what might happen, but to what extent the crisis, as it escalates, and the option of going full on back to North Korea is actually appealing or not for part of the military leadership.
Interesting. So here's a question that they're asking: how will businesses react to the instructions by the interim government that forbid companies to deal with or recognize or make payments to the SAC and the institutions controlled by it?
Well, I think that's one for Alexander.
I'll try. I think Vinny will probably have a better idea. Domestically, obviously, the businesses, you know, will have to follow domestic law. If you know, there's imposition by the government, even if they recognize it or not, that's what they have to deal with. The bigger issue is for international businesses is what do you do to cross border? How do you transfer money internationally? Because the banks are the ones who will probably be the spooks. They will be spooked the most by the situation. They will take the most conservative view on payments going in and out of Myanmar, in making sure that they're not in any way, you know, creating a possibility that there will be in violation of sanctions. So domestically, businesses, unfortunately, I think will have to follow, you know, what the law will dictate them. And same thing internationally. The problem will be if they're going to be conflicting instructions. You know, the US and the other sanctions will tell them one thing: do not work with this bank, do not work with this entity. It hasn't been said, but it may be said. But internally, they may have to do this, something that's, you know, it'll be no choice. So it's a tough one. For businesses, I think it's a tough one. International businesses in particular, currently, you know, internationally from US side, again, there's no significant restrictions, but there's plenty of time for them to figure out what to do internationally. And there's obviously going to be some learning curve what to do domestically.
Can I just add to that, having covered Myanmar earlier in my career with the Financial Times, from after the end of 2010, when Aung San Suu Kyi was first released from her final stage of house arrest, and Myanmar was still under very heavy sanctions. I was dealing with companies, and Theory, you would know all about this, but you know, those sort of rules about doing any business or paying any money to entities linked to the military was so draconian that, you know, I was talking to companies, foreigners, that were petrified because they were doing business with a Myanmar company that might have a supply contract for, I don't know, toothpaste to the military, or, you know, a garment manufacturer that was doing some stitching that turned out to be for uniforms that were going to military linked entities. So I think all these, it's an absolute minefield, and And it created an incredible boon for law firms, consultancies, due diligence. Every company needed to thoroughly check out any company it was doing business with, because the fines from the US side, the penalties were extremely harsh. And I think they're up to, went up to about $100,000 easy, and much more for, direct knowing, if you knowledge of contracts with military linked entities. So I think all that is inevitably going to come back, and that is incredibly inhibiting, even if we can get through this current violence, very inhibiting.
But this was sort of the issue with Kirin ultimately, wasn't it?
Mm. Yeah, well,
the Japanese beer company.
You might know, but we also covered Kirin, and which was in a joint venture with the Myanmar military through its company, which was part of the military conglomerate MEHL, and is brewer of the most popular beer brand by far in Myanmar, which was is Myanmar beer. And Kirin ran and swiftly and wisely made the decision to announce a withdrawal from that joint venture within a couple of days of the coup, but is now stuck with the massive headache of a stake that is worth more than $500 million. And they're not going to get the military to buy that stake out. Are they going to be able to sell their stake? Who would buy into Myanmar now to the tune of $500 million? But anyway, Alexander, you probably looked at the Kirin.
I can't say much, frankly speaking, for confidential reasons. But I think, look, there is obviously a consideration beyond sanctions. There are reputational issues that some companies will be careful to consider. Working with military may not be illegal from a sanctions point of view, but if the same company works internationally in other parts of the world where people will take notice of what is your global operations, that may impact the company's decisions to whether continuously work or not. And we've seen this, the human rights legislation and forced labor legislation, they're coming through, and they have been already on books in the UK, Europe, California, and other places. I think, Gwen, you made another point, and maybe it will resonate with a lot of people. It's not just the sanctions themselves, it's how you enforce them. The banking sector has become the real enforcer of the sanctions. They're the ones who take a zero risk approach in the most cases to sanctions. So if they smell something that's fishy, like you were saying, the toothpaste, I don't know that example, but if they smell something fishy, that payments may end up in the hands of persons or entities that are sanctioned or related to sanctioned entities. And as you can imagine, those people who are sanctioned, they will not be visible. They will try to hide their traces. So
right.
If due diligence will indicate any sense of exposure, the risk appetite will be different between companies and banks, because banks are the ones who will be paying have to pay penalties, and they will be the ones who will take a very careful approach, which is why I'm saying currently you don't see any sanctions really having any impact. But if and when they do, and if they revert to somewhat a version of what happened before, they may, again, it will be the banking community that will step in. I've worked in some cases now in the past where the ports were partially owned by military, and they often had to issue special guidance and special licenses to allow banking sector to transfer money for shipments, because the banking sector said, no, we don't want to be working, supporting shipments because they go through ports that may be owned by military. And often in late days of sanctions, they did issue special license allowing that the payments to proceed. So I'll leave you with that. But I think we'll need to see the money flow, how the banks react, and what will happen domestically. It will impact all of that.
Just to back up and make a very basic point that maybe some people aren't aware of. I mean, the thing that was interesting to me about Kirin is that it showed this was a business. Beer was not a business that I think many people in the outside world would expect the military to have some kind of link to. Could someone just kind of give a brief overview of just what their interests the range of their interests. I know there's gyms and mining and so forth, but.
Well,
prior to the opening of the country, you know, a lot of businesses were operated under licenses. So much of the economy, and this is not necessarily legacy of military rule. This is a legacy also of socialist style command and control economy, with the state sector owning a lot of businesses. So, you know, you must never forget when we talk about the Myanmar economy, that it still hasn't completed a full transition from state-owned to you know, more of a market-based private sector. So some of it is a legacy of that. So it's not just the military that owns businesses; it's ministries still run businesses. And that's across the board. So the military holding companies do have interests across the board. Beer was one of the industries that were controlled. So, you know, their licenses that were given only to the military. So and that's the legacy. But you know, you'll see the military having the military holding companies having interests across the board. So it's not just extractives and all that, but you know, you have canning, you've got, you know, there's a light bulb manufacturing. You know, it's not how do you call it? It's not anything strange in a way. It's a legacy of the state-owned sector being strong, or being dominant rather.
And to add to that, I think I think this question is very important, because this is a question that is being discussed right now by policymakers in the West, as they are wondering who to put on those sanctions lists, right? And who to start with and who to go to next, etc. So I know this question is being asked and looked at into great detail. And I think it's quite complex, and it's important to differentiate between the above board military interests, which might be, which are most well known, MEHL and MEC, so the two military conglomerates. MEHL kind of works as a pension fund for the militaries. There's been quite a lot of information coming out on them recently. And you know, they have investment in ports, beer, other consumer goods, logistics, etc., etc. But anyway, again, that's above board. And then what is assessed is that you have the under the surface interest of the military, not as an institution, but for its leadership and various people there, with a number of local business people who act as proxies, and which, by the way, means right now we are talking about targeted sanctions. If the reality is that these people that are going to be targeted, they don't hold any assets in the West, or maybe possibly even in Singapore or Hong Kong under their own name, or under the name of their children or direct relatives. It's going to be through proxies, Myanmar proxies, foreign proxies, etc. So now, how do you make a case, a legal case, and maybe Alexander can weigh in on that, to show that there is a connection between these people and the Myanmar military folks who you are trying to target? Because as you know, and Alexander, please weigh in recent years, some of these sanctions have not necessarily in relation to Myanmar, but also in relation to Myanmar, were contested in court. What is the legal basis for which my children are targeted, the children are targeted, or this person is targeted? So again, I think this means that as a result, preparing sanctions, especially targeted sanctions that are effective, requires a lot of digging, a lot of evidence gathering, and it's extremely challenging, which might explain also to some extent why it's taking so much time for the EU to come up with its own sanctions, and maybe for the US to come with the next round, etc.
Yeah, maybe just quickly correct you. I'm sorry to do this, because you're European, mon ami, and you can't contest sanctions in Europe. If OFAC puts you on a SDN list, you can't go to court necessarily. You will have to use other means to figure out why you were there, and etc. What happened in the States is how the sanctions were enforced against some of the companies who were penalized for working with sanctioned entities, etc. Because the actual sanctions prohibitions maybe were not clear, but the actual designation, and in this case for Myanmar as well, Chris, this is important to emphasize, OFAC has a very wide authority to designate pretty much anyone they want under the current degree issued by Biden. They began narrowly, but they can go widen up. You know, there's plenty of authority for OFAC to do, and there's going to be very little any junta can go to U.S. courts to contest that.
That's interesting. One of our viewers asked, they said, we've been talking about mostly U.S. Sanctions. They asked about responses from the EU and responses from other Asian nations. If
sure, okay. If you want me, I can briefly mention. I mean, again, I think that we see now a bit of a cohesive approach to Myanmar sanctions. Again, making them targeted. So Canada, I think, has issued sanctions. EU is considering. EU requires the consensus of all the countries, and it's a bit stronger process. UK, that's now independent of EU and has its own actually quite well. They're putting in place quite active sanctions programs and procedures. They've issued some, again, initial targeted sanctions. Frankly, why are we talking about the US sanctions? Because they may apply to anyone in the world. You know, US sanctions are uniquely extraterritorial and what typically is called secondary sanctions, when they can apply to a Japanese company doing business in Myanmar, not using US dollars, not using US persons, and yet the US sanctions may regulate certain types of transactions. That is not the case for EU and UK. That will be for European and UK companies that are domestic, or UK persons or EU persons. They will need to follow domestic law. But the Japanese company working in Myanmar doesn't, you know, without any other EU or UK element, doesn't need to worry about those sanctions. They may need to worry about UN, and they will need to worry about US.
Thank you. So we've only got a few minutes left. There's a question here that I think is really interesting about how much of this current situation can be attributed to the personality of the junta leader, and are there factions within the military that are unhappy, right? So I guess the suggestion is there, you know, is it a unified front against the people ultimately? Hard to know, but anybody want to have a crack?
Yeah, I'd love to. As having covered Myanmar since, as I said, a decade, I can say I've closely watched Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and in fact covered quite closely the appalling drive against the Rohingya Muslims, which actually began with quite a bit of violence in 2013-14, surged in 2016 actually, and spilled into 2017. So you can say that alone, I think, was driven by one man, and that was him. He directed the whole thing. He controlled the units. He sent in the nastiest, most brutal army units, I think, obviously with a carte blanche to, I think the world watched the atrocities back then. I think he is probably single-handedly responsible for the expulsion of nearly 1 million people, but also the horrific deaths and maimings of thousands. So there's that. And then, you know, enter stage left, back again, in this, heading this campaign and the coup and the campaign of terror. The military is such a world on its own, and so structured, so hierarchical, and in its own way disciplined. People might get the impression that these soldiers on the street in orgies of shooting and killing are undisciplined. They are robots. We've seen defections, they're mainly of police, but I think only there was a chink of light when I think one soldier defected at the weekend, which is extraordinary when you think it's the largest, one of the largest standing armies. It claims 500,000 men. I think it's little more than maybe 250 to 350,000. That's still a lot. And I think Min Aung Hlaing on his own actually directs the whole thing, and every hierarchy under him, every layer is extremely obedient. And is there, my dream was the possibility of a counter coup, but I just can't see it happening. It's so structured to stamp out any kind of dissent. I don't know what Theory, you're the Burmese person, so maybe you have a view.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, right? It's culturally, we're a hierarchical society. It's a hierarchical organization within a hierarchical society. So very hard to say, but no organization is a monolith. So there will be different points of view, but yeah, it's super hard to tell from the outside because the institution is so insular that those of us who are not interacting with individuals involved just don't know. We've been constantly surprised at what comes out at the leadership level. But yeah, as Gwen said, even in the Ne Win era, which is a quasi-civilian, pretend socialist country, and he would take out his number twos regularly. So yeah, hard to say.
Yes. I'm afraid we're actually out of time. I really want to thank all of you for this. This has been fascinating, really interesting. I've learned so much just from listening to all of you. So thank you on behalf of the audience, and also thanks to all of our viewers for watching. It's great to see so many different countries represented here. So remember to keep up with all the Myanmar news on Nikkei Asia. And thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for great moderation. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.